"They burned my farm," he said. And the silence on the other end of that phone line lasted exactly 3 seconds before Marcus Walker answered. "We're coming." 32 years of quiet, 32 years of Caleb Dawson choosing peace over everything he used to be. And in one night, one single night of flames and smoke, and men who laughed while they walked away, all of it burned down with the barn. They thought they had broken an old man. They had no idea what they had just woken up. If this story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow along until the very end. Drop a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The men came on a Tuesday. Caleb knew they were coming before he heard the trucks. He had lived long enough to recognize that particular kind of quiet, the kind that falls over a property when something wrong is approaching. The dogs stopped barking 20 minutes before the headlights swept across the front field. The horses pressed themselves to the far wall of the stable. Even the wind seemed to pull back like it didn't want any part of what was about to happen. I was sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee that had gone cold 2 hours ago when the first set of headlights turned off the main road and started down his drive. Then a second set, then a third, 3 vehicles moving slow and deliberate the way people move when they want you to see them coming and feel the weight of them before they even stop. Caleb set the coffee mug down on the railing. He didn't reach for anything, he just watched. The trucks parked in a loose half circle facing the porch, and 6 men climbed out. They were built the way men get built when someone is paying them to be physical, not athletic, just heavy and purposeful. The kind of bodies that communicate a threat without saying a word. The one in front was younger than the others, maybe 35, with a clean jacket, and the careful posture of a man who delivers messages for someone who prefers not to deliver them himself. "Mr. Dawson," he said. He didn't climb the porch steps. He stood at the bottom and looked up, which was a choice. "We've been trying to reach you." "I got the letters," Caleb said. "I read them." "Then you understand Mr. Holston's position." "I understand he wants my land," Caleb said. "I also understand." My answer was no, 3 times. 3. The man in the clean jacket tilted his head slightly, the way a person does when they're deciding how much patience to burn through before they say the thing they actually came to say. "Mr. Dawson, this is going to happen. The highway project has already been approved at the state level. The question isn't whether your land gets used, it's whether you walk away with something or walk away with nothing. My wife planted those apple trees along the east fence 26 years ago, Caleb said. The offer on the table wouldn't cover the cost of a decent funeral, let alone what this land is worth. The offer is generous considering the circumstances. What circumstances would those be? The man smiled, and it was the kind of smile that doesn't reach anything above the lips. The circumstances of a man your age, living alone, trying to manage 40 acres without any help. He let that sit for a moment. Things happen on farms, Mr. Dawson. Equipment breaks down. Fires start. It gets hard to manage everything by yourself. Caleb looked at him for a long moment without answering. He looked at each of the 5 men standing behind him. He took in their positions, their stances, the way 2 of them had drifted slightly to the left. Not enough to be obvious, but enough. Old habits recognize old patterns. "You can go now," Caleb said quietly. The man in the jacket held his gaze for another few seconds. Then he nodded once and turned back toward the trucks. The 5 men followed. Caleb listened to the engine start, watched the headlights cut back toward the main road, and stayed on that porch until the sound of them was completely gone. Then he went inside, sat down at the kitchen table, and pressed both hands flat against the wood. They were trembling, not from fear, from something older than fear, something that had been asleep beside him for 30 years and had just opened one eye. He breathed through it. He made himself breathe through it. Rachel's photograph was on the counter beside the coffee maker, the one from their second summer here, when she was laughing at something he'd said, and the light was catching her hair just right. He looked at it for a long time. "I'm handling it," he said to the photograph. "I promise." He went to bed that night and didn't sleep, and somewhere around 3 in the morning, he heard the first crackle. He smelled it before the sound fully registered. That particular combination of old dry wood and something accelerant, something chemical underneath the natural burn, the kind of smell that tells you immediately this wasn't an accident. He was out of bed and through the back door in seconds, and the barn was already fully involved, flames tearing up through the roof and throwing orange light across everything for 100 yards in every direction. Caleb ran toward it. He knew he couldn't do anything. Some part of his brain that was still operating on logic was telling him that, telling him clearly, but his legs were already moving, and he crossed half the distance before the heat stopped him. A physical wall of it pressing against his chest and face, stealing the air from his lungs. He stood there and watched it burn. Inside that barn were Rachel's tools, the ones she had used in the garden for 20 years, organized on the pegboard, the way she liked them, still hanging in exactly the arrangement she'd left them the last time she used them. Her old wheelbarrow with the cracked wooden handles she'd refused to replace because she said it had character. 3 boxes of her photographs that he'd moved out there last spring while he was reorganizing the house, intending to bring them back in and never getting around to it. Gone, all of it, gone in the time it took him to wake up and run across the yard. He heard laughter from the tree line to the north. Not nervous laughter, not the awkward kind that comes from people who feel guilty. The easy, comfortable laughter of men who feel entirely safe doing what they are doing. One of them stepped far enough out of the trees to be visible in the firelight. Just far enough. He called out across the yard, his voice carrying clear and satisfied over the sound of the fire. Old men who refused to move lose everything, Mr. Dawson. Then they were gone. Trucks somewhere on the back road. He hadn't known they'd found engine sounds fading north toward the highway. Caleb stood in the heat of his burning barn and didn't move for a very long time. His nearest neighbor, Gerald Pueat, arrived 20 minutes later, having seen the glow from his place, 3/4 of a mile east. He pulled up in his old pickup, climbed out and stood beside Caleb without saying anything for a full minute. Gerald was 71, had farmed his family's land his entire life, and understood that some moments don't require words. Finally, he put a hand on Caleb's shoulder. "You need to call the fire department," Gerald said quietly. "Already called," Caleb said. "They're coming." Was it them? Caleb didn't answer immediately. He watched a section of the roof collapse inward, sending a column of sparks spiraling up into the dark sky above Silver Creek. "One of them said something to me before they left," Caleb said. "Before they left, they wanted me to hear them say it." "What did they say?" "Doesn't matter what they said." Caleb's voice was completely flat. It was the flatness of a man who has moved past emotion into something else entirely, something quieter and more permanent. "What matters is that they made a mistake." Gerald looked at him sideways. Caleb hadn't moved. His eyes were still on the fire. "They came here thinking they knew who I was," Caleb said. "They looked at this farm, and they saw an old man alone, somebody they could push." "Caleb, they don't know who I was before this farm." Gerald was quiet for a moment. He had known Caleb Dawson for 15 years, lived down the road from him, helped him through the first winter after Rachel died, sat at his kitchen table more times than he could count. And in all those years, Caleb had never once talked about his life before Silver Creek. "Who were you?" Gerald asked carefully. Caleb finally turned away from the fire and looked at him. In the firelight, something had shifted in Caleb Dawson's face, some arrangement of muscle and expression that Gerald had never seen on him before. Something that made the 71-year-old farmer take a very small, entirely involuntary step backward. "Somebody they should have researched before they struck a match," Caleb said. "So the fire department came and did what fire departments do when there is nothing left to save. They kept the fire from spreading and watched it burn itself out." The volunteer fire chief, a man named Dale Patterson, who had known Caleb for 12 years, walked him through the assessment in the gray early morning light and didn't ask questions that didn't have answers yet. "Accelerant for sure," Dale said. "Multiple points of origin. This was set deliberately, Caleb. You need to get law enforcement involved." "I know. You going to call Sheriff Brooks?" "I'm going to call the sheriff," Caleb said. "Yes." Dale studied him for a moment with the careful eyes of a man who has known someone long enough to notice a change. "You all right?" "I'm fine," Caleb said. I wasn't fine. He knew he wasn't fine, but he also knew that what he was feeling wasn't going to disrupt his thinking because he had trained himself a long time ago in a life that felt like it belonged to a different person, to separate feeling from functioning. The feelings were real. They were going to be real for a long time, especially the grief, because that barn full of Rachel's things was gone, and that was a loss that was going to open back up on quiet nights for years. I understood that. But grief and function could exist at the same time. He had learned that lesson the hard way, and he hadn't forgotten it. After Dale and the volunteers left, Caleb walked back to the house. He went to the kitchen, made a pot of coffee that this time he actually drank, and sat at the table while the sun came up over the eastern ridge and threw pale light across the fields Rachel had loved. He sat there for 45 minutes, thinking, not feeling thinking, working through what he knew, what he didn't know, and what the next steps had to be. Victor Holston, he had done some research on his own after the second letter arrived enough to understand who he was dealing with. Holston Development Group, based out of Billings, with significant construction contracts tied to state highway projects. The kind of operation that existed in the space between legitimate business and something considerably less legitimate. The kind of man who had learned over years of doing business this way that farmers in small towns were isolated and vulnerable, and that local law enforcement had limited resources and limited motivation to investigate people with political connections. That calculation was not wrong. It was just incomplete, because Victor Holston had never burned the barn of a man who used to be called Iron Wolf. Caleb went to the bedroom closet and moved the 3 boxes stacked in the back left corner. Behind them, set into the wall, was a panel he had installed himself when they first moved in. Not particularly sophisticated, just a piece of fitted board with a piano hinge and a magnetic latch that you had to know was there to find it. He opened it. Inside was a metal box approximately the size of a large shoebox sealed with a combination lock. He hadn't opened it in 19 years. He remembered the last time clearly, the night Rachel had found him sitting with it on the bedroom floor, turning the combination, not opening it, just holding it. She had sat down beside him without asking what it was, had put her head on his shoulder, and after a long time she had said, "Whatever's in there, it doesn't have to come out unless you need it to." "I don't need it," he had told her that night. He needed it now. The combination was the date they had first ridden into Silver Creek together and decided this was the place. He had done that on purpose years ago, so that the only way into this box was through that memory. The lock opened. Inside was a photograph, black and white, slightly faded, a man in his mid-30s, standing with a group of riders in front of a long, low building somewhere that no longer existed. The man in the center of the group had Caleb's eyes, but everything else about him was different. The leather, the posture, the expression that said he had been tested in ways most people never encountered and had not broken. Iron Wolf, that was the name the photograph belonged to. Not Caleb Dawson, farmer, widower, neighbor, quiet man. Iron Wolf, who had earned that name over 15 years of roads and brotherhood and standing between vulnerable people and the kind of predators who only operate when they believe their targets are defenseless. Beneath the photograph was a folded piece of paper with a phone number written on it in Caleb's own handwriting. Beneath that was a letter he had received 11 years ago that he had never answered. Beneath the letter was a card from a funeral, and beneath the card was a small leather patch, a name and a title, and a set of colors that he had handed over formally 30 years ago when he made the decision to put that life behind him. He picked up the piece of paper with the phone number. He looked at it for a long time. Then he went back to the kitchen, picked up his phone and dialed. It rang 4 times. He had expected voicemail. He had prepared a message in his head. The 5th ring cut short. "Yeah." The voice on the other end was deep alert, the voice of a man who had been awake since before Caleb called. Around 50, Caleb calculated. The boy he had known would be around 50 now. "Marcus," Caleb said. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. "Iron Wolf." It wasn't a question. Marcus Walker's voice had changed from the 20-year-old Caleb remembered, had deepened and steadied, but the recognition in it was immediate and absolute. "I wondered if I'd ever hear from you." "I didn't think you would either," Caleb said. "Something happened." "They burned my farm," Caleb said. 3 words. He hadn't planned to say it that simply, but that was what came out. Flat, plain, true. The silence this time was shorter. 1 second. "Where are you?" Marcus said. "Silver Creek, Montana. Same place I've been." "What do you need?" Caleb almost said nothing. The word was right there, habitual, 30 years of self-sufficiency, right behind it. He looked out the kitchen window at the field Rachel had planted and the blackened footprint where the barn used to be. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "I need someone to know what happened." "I know," Marcus said. "I've known for 32 years that if you ever called, whatever it was would be real." "Marcus, you saved my life," Marcus said, and his voice had no performance in it, no drama, just the simple weight of a fact that had shaped everything that came after it. "You came when nobody else came. You pulled me out of something I was never going to walk out of on my own. I was 20 years old and I didn't understand what you were risking to do that. I understand now. Caleb was quiet. Whatever they burn, Marcus said, we're going to help you rebuild it. I don't want revenge, Caleb said. And he meant it. He needed Marcus to understand that he meant it. Tell me what you want. I want justice, Caleb said. Real justice. The kind that sticks. The kind that protects other people from what just happened to me, because I have a feeling I'm not the only one this has happened to. All right, Marcus said. And then with a certainty that Caleb hadn't heard from another human being in years, that specific quality of certainty that comes from people who have made real promises and kept them, were coming. He called the sheriff's office after he hung up with Marcus. Sheriff Daniel Brooks drove out himself within the hour, which said something about the sheriff, or maybe about the fact that it was a Tuesday morning in Silver Creek, and this was the most significant crime call he'd had in months. Brooks was 52, a careful man, the kind of law enforcement officer who had grown up watching how things worked in counties where developers and landowners and political money all moved in the same circles, and who had made a personal policy of keeping his head down and his evidence standards high before he said anything to anybody. He walked the site of the barn that Caleb listened to the fire chief's assessment, looked at the multiple ignition points without touching anything, and took his time before he spoke. You said they delivered an offer, he said finally. 3 offers over 6 weeks, Caleb said, all through official-looking letters from Holston Development Group, all below market by at least 40%. You kept the letters? Every one of them. Brooks looked at the burn site again. You said a man spoke to you from the tree line. One of the men who was here earlier in the evening. Clean jacket, younger than the others. He was the one who made the comments about fires starting and equipment breaking down. You didn't call us after that visit. I didn't have anything to call you with, Caleb said. A man making vague comments on my porch isn't a crime I can report. I know how this works. Brooks met his eyes. Do you? I know what evidence looks like, Caleb said. And I know what a case looks like when there isn't enough of one. I've seen the way Holston's name moves through this county. I wasn't going to bring you a complaint that went nowhere and gave him time to get his story straight. The sheriff was quiet for a moment, looking at him with the careful attention of a man recalibrating what he thought he knew about his subject. Most people in your position would have called us right after the visit. Most people, Caleb agreed without explaining further. Mr. Dawson, Brooks said carefully, is there anything about your background I should know about? Anything that would help me understand? There's nothing that's going to make this complicated for you, Caleb said. I'm a 68-year-old farmer and my barn is burned down by men working for Victor Holston. That's the case. Everything else about me is irrelevant. Brooks held his gaze for a moment. Then he nodded slowly. I'm going to need you to come in and give a full statement. I'll be there this afternoon. And Mr. Dawson, if anyone else contacts you, any visits, any phone calls, I'll document everything, Caleb said. After the sheriff left, Gerald Pwitt came back. He had gone home to tend his animals and returned with a casserole his wife had made, which was the rural Montana version of saying everything that needed to be said about how people support each other. He set it on the kitchen counter, poured himself a cup of coffee from Caleb's pot, and sat down at the kitchen table like he planned to stay a while. You called someone, Gerald said. It wasn't a question. Caleb looked at him. How do you know that? Because you were angrier last night than I've ever seen any man be, Gerald said. And this morning you're completely calm. The only time a man gets that calm after that much anger is when he's made a decision and set something in motion. He wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. I know you, Caleb. I've known you 15 years. That calm you've got right now is not the calm of a man who is waiting for the sheriff to sort things out. Caleb sat down across from him. He looked at Gerald Pwitt, at his weathered face, his careful eyes, the hands of a man who had worked land his entire life and understood what it meant to lose pieces of it, to people who saw it only as a number on a ledger. I made a phone call, Caleb confirmed. To who? To someone who owes me a debt, Caleb said, and who has the ability to help make sure that what happened here doesn't go the way Victor Holston planned. Gerald was quiet for a moment. The bikers, he said. Caleb didn't react. I've lived in this county a long time, Gerald said quietly. I've heard things about who you might have been before you came here. I never asked because it wasn't my business, and you were a good neighbor and a good man, and none of the rest of it mattered. He looked at Caleb steadily. Does it matter now? What I was before doesn't matter, Caleb said. What I built here matters. What Rachel and I made here matters. And the people who tried to take it by burning it down in the middle of the night, they matter. Because if I don't stop them, they're going to do it to the next person. Gerald nodded slowly. He picked up his coffee. He drank. Then after a long moment, "I've got something you should know." Caleb looked at him. "The Delaney place," Gerald said. 2 years ago, Pete Delaney, 73 years old, third-generation farmer, refused 3 lowball offers on his land. Barn fire. Pete's wife was inside doing laundry and barely got out. They said it was electrical. Pete sold 2 weeks later. He met Caleb's eyes. He called me the night he signed, told me he didn't have a choice, told me he was ashamed. Gerald's jaw was tight. He shouldn't have been ashamed. He was alone. His wife was scared. And nobody came to help him. Something settled in Caleb's chest. Not surprised, he had suspected something like this, had told Marcus on the phone that he thought he wasn't the only one. But hearing it confirmed hearing about Pete Delaney's wife in the laundry room, in the fire, something settled hard and permanent. "How many, Gerald?" Gerald looked at the table. "I can think of 4 in the last 3 years. All older farmers, all solo operations, all had some connection to the highway expansion corridor. All barn fires or equipment destruction. All sold within a month." "Did you tell the sheriff?" "What was I going to tell him? I had suspicions. I had patterns. I had the word of frightened old men who just wanted it over." He looked up. "I didn't have proof." Caleb looked at him for a long moment. "Gerald," he said carefully, "have you been keeping records?" Gerald reached into the chest pocket of his flannel shirt and pulled out a small worn notebook. He set it on the table between them. "Since Pete Delaney called me," he said quietly, "I wrote down everything. Dates, names, what they told me happened, what their land sold for, who it sold to." He looked at the notebook, then at Caleb. "I didn't know what to do with it. I knew if I brought it to the sheriff without something solid to back it up, Holston's lawyers would bury it, and I'd end up with a fire of my own." Caleb looked at the notebook. Gerald pushed it across the table. "I think," Gerald said slowly, "that maybe you know what to do with it." Caleb picked it up. He opened it and read the first page, Pete Delaney's name, a date. A description in Gerald's careful handwriting of exactly what Pete had told him on the phone. Below it, a second name. A third. The amounts the properties had sold for. The name of the buyer in each case, a shell company called Mountain Corridor Development, LLC, registered in Delaware. Mountain Corridor Development, LLC. He would need to check, but he was almost certain that string led back to Victor Holston through enough layers to look legitimate until someone with the right tools looked carefully at it. He closed the notebook. "I thought about Rachel and about the apple trees she had planted along the east fence and about the boxes of photographs that were now ash and char under what remained of the barn's foundation. He thought about Pete Delaney's wife running out of a laundry room in the middle of the night. He thought about 4 other families who had sold their land for less than it was worth because nobody came when they needed help. And he thought about a 20-year-old kid named Marcus Walker bleeding in a parking lot in a city Caleb barely remembered. Now 3 men with bad intentions closing in and nobody else around to do anything about it. Caleb had been around that night. He had made a choice to be around. Marcus had never forgotten it. Neither had he. He set Gerald's notebook down on the table beside the photograph he had taken out of the metal box and placed on the kitchen counter that morning. The photograph of Iron Wolf, the younger man with his eyes in somebody else's life. "Victor Holston looked at me," Caleb said, "and he saw an old farmer alone on 40 acres. Gerald waited. "He made the same mistake everyone makes," Caleb said. "He saw what was in front of him and didn't ask what was behind it." Outside across the field, the black scar where the barn used to stand was still sending up thin ribbons of smoke in the morning air. The apple trees along the east fence were still there, still green, still alive. Rachel's trees. Caleb Dawson looked at them through the kitchen window and made her a promise that he intended to keep. He had spent 30 years building something worth protecting. Now he was going to protect it. And the men who had driven away laughing, who had gone back to report to Victor Holston that the old farmer on Silver Creek Road had been dealt with, those men had set in motion something they had absolutely no framework for understanding, because they had lit a fire thinking it would destroy something. They had no idea that fire was the thing that had woken Iron Wolf up. Gerald left around noon, but not before Caleb made him promise one thing. "Don't tell anyone about the notebook," Caleb said. "Not your wife, not your neighbors, not the men at the feed store. Nobody." Gerald looked at him with the steady eyes of a man who understood exactly why that instruction had been given. Understood. And if anyone comes to your property asking questions about me, anyone at all, you call me before you say a single word to them. You think they'll come to me? They watch this farm, Caleb said. That means they watched who comes and goes. They saw your truck here this morning. You're already connected to this in their minds. He held Gerald's gaze. These are not careful people, Gerald. They're bold because they've gotten away with it before. Bold people get sloppy, but sloppy people can still do a lot of damage before they make their mistake. Gerald nodded, tucked his chin down, and drove back toward his place on the eastern road. Caleb spent the rest of the morning on the phone with his insurance company, which was a special kind of misery. Not because the people were unkind, but because the process of reducing 30 years of life to a claim number required a particular detachment that cost him more than he expected. The barn was insured, the structure would be covered. The contents, Rachel's tools, her photographs, the wheelbarrow with the cracked handle, those were another conversation entirely, full of phrases like documented value and replacement cost that had nothing to do with what had actually been destroyed. I got through it. He drove into town at 2 o'clock to give his formal statement to the sheriff, sat across from Daniel Brooks in an office that smelled like old coffee and printer ink, and walked through every detail in exact sequence. He kept his language plain. He didn't editorialize. He gave the sheriff clean, usable facts because he understood what an investigation needed and what it didn't, and the last thing he wanted was for his statement to give Holston's lawyers any kind of traction. Brooks listened without interrupting. He took notes. At the end, he asked one question that wasn't about the fire. Mr. Dawson, are you planning to do anything outside of this process? Caleb looked at him. I plan to protect my property and my safety while you do your job, Sheriff. If that requires taking legal and reasonable steps, I'll take them. Brooks held his gaze for a moment. That's a careful answer. It's an honest one, Caleb said. He drove home as the afternoon light started going golden over the ridge, and he sat on the porch where 2 nights ago he had watched 3 trucks come down his drive, and he waited. Marcus called at 6:47 that evening. We're 12 hours out, Marcus said. 14 of us. We'll come in quiet, no formation, staggered arrival, nothing that looks like a convoy. I don't want to give whoever's watching a reason to call in something that complicates your situation with local law. Caleb absorbed this. 14 riders arriving staggered, so they didn't look like what they were. That was the thinking of a man who had spent 30 years learning exactly the same kinds of lessons Caleb had once taught. You've gotten careful, Caleb said. I learned it from someone careful, Marcus replied. There's more to this than just my barn, Caleb said. I need you to know that before you get here. This isn't just about me. Tell me. Caleb told him about Gerald's notebook, about Pete Delaney's wife in the laundry room, about the 4 farms, the shell company, the pattern that had been running for at least 3 years through the highway expansion corridor. When he finished, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. So he's been running this for years, Marcus said, burning out old farmers and buying their land for nothing. That's what the evidence suggests. And nobody stopped him because every victim was isolated and the incidents looked individual. Exactly. Until he picked the wrong farmer. Until he picked the wrong farmer, Caleb confirmed. Another pause shorter this time. We're going to need to think bigger than just your property. I know, Caleb said. That's why I told you. After he hung up, he went back inside and did something he had been avoiding since that morning. He went to the kitchen counter and picked up Rachel's photograph, the one from their second summer, her laughing in the good light, and he carried it to the bedroom and set it on the nightstand where it used to be, before he'd moved it to the kitchen after she died, because he needed to see her face when he made his coffee in the mornings. He stood looking at it for a long time. They came for what we built, he said quietly. I'm not going to let that stand. He didn't explain further. He had never needed to explain further to her. That had been one of the gifts of their life together. She had always understood the shape of what he meant, even when the words were incomplete. He went to bed, and this time he slept. The first of them arrived the next morning at 7:15. Not a convoy, not a formation, just a single rider on a big road bike pulling into the drive at a measured pace, parking in the gravel beside Caleb's truck, and removing a helmet to reveal a man in his late 40s with a close-cut beard and the particular posture of someone who has spent decades on the road. He walked to the porch and extended his hand. Tommy Briggs, he said, I'm Marcus's road captain. He sent me ahead. Caleb shook his hand. How far back is Marcus? 2 hours. He wants to make sure the approach is clean. Tommy looked at the property with the deliberate scan of a man doing an automatic assessment. I'm supposed to walk the ground before everyone arrives. Get a read on what we're dealing with. Come inside, Caleb said. Coffee's on. They sat at the kitchen table, and Tommy Briggs turned out to be the kind of man who asked precise, useful questions. How many access points to the property? What visibility was like from the main road? Whether Caleb had any security cameras he didn't, and whether the neighbors in the area were likely to report unusual activity to anyone. Gerald Pewitt to the east is solid, Caleb said. The Hendersons to the west are quiet, keep to themselves, probably won't notice or care. The property to the north is empty. The Larson place sold 8 months ago and nobody's moved in yet. Tommy made a mental note of all of it without writing anything down. What about Holston's people? You think they're watching the property? I think they believe the situation is resolved, Caleb said. They burned the barn, sent a message, and expected me to fold inside a week. They're probably monitoring, but they're not expecting a response, let alone this kind of response. Good, Tommy said. Let's use that window. He wrapped his hands around his coffee cup. Marcus is going to want to hear everything you told him on the phone in detail once he's here. The other thing he's going to want to know is what kind of resources you have locally. People who know the county, know the law enforcement, know where Holston's connections run. Caleb thought about Gerald in his notebook. He thought about something else, a name that had surfaced during his research into Holston's operation, a name he had been turning over since the night before. There's a woman in town, Caleb said. Name's Leanne Pwitt, Gerald's daughter. She works for the county assessor's office. She's sharp, she knows property records better than anyone in Silver Creek, and she has no reason to like Victor Holston. He tried to develop a parcel adjacent to her parents' property 2 years ago, and she's the one who found the zoning irregularities that blocked it. Tommy raised an eyebrow. She know anything about what's been happening? Her father will have told her about my barn. Whether she knows the full pattern, I'm not sure. But she's the kind of person who, if she understood what was going on, would be motivated to help. And you trust her, Caleb considered. I trust Gerald, and Gerald trusts her completely. That's enough for me right now. Tommy nodded. He looked around the kitchen at Rachel's photograph on the nightstand visible through the bedroom doorway, at the worn edges of the table at the old calendar, still showing the month Rachel had last changed it. He took all of it in with a quiet respect. Marcus told me about you, Tommy said. Not details, just enough that you were someone he wouldn't be alive without. He said it simply without ceremony. That matters to the guys coming today. They're not here because Marcus told them to come. They're here because he told them who you were and why you called, and every one of them said yes without being asked twice. Caleb looked at his coffee. He didn't know what to do with that kind of information. He never had. They don't know me, he said. They know Marcus, Tommy said. And Marcus doesn't call things like this lightly. In 32 years, he's never called something like this. He met Caleb's eyes. You're the only person Marcus Walker has ever said he owes his life to. That's not nothing. That's everything. The second and third riders arrived within an hour of each other, both coming in from different directions as Marcus had planned, both presenting as ordinary travelers to anyone watching from the road. By noon, there were 7 men on the property, all disciplined, none drawing attention, spread out in ways that covered the access points without looking like they were covering access points. At 2:17 in the afternoon, Marcus Walker turned off the main road onto Caleb's drive. He was nothing like the 20-year-old Caleb remembered, and completely recognizable as the same person. The bone structure was the same, the eyes were the same, but everything else had been shaped by 50 years of living in a way that the photograph in Caleb's metal box could never have predicted. He was broad through the shoulders, gray at the temples, and he walked with the authority of a man who had never needed to perform it, because it was simply what he was. He came up the porch steps and stopped 2 feet from Caleb Dawson. They looked at each other for a long moment. Then Marcus did something that surprised Caleb. He put his arms around him, not a handshake, not a careful distance, keeping greeting out. He embraced him the way a man embraces someone who pulled him out of the worst night of his life when he was 20 years old and scared and certain he was going to die. Caleb stood still for half a second. Then he returned it. When Marcus stepped back, his eyes were clear and steady. You look old, he said. You look worse, Caleb said. Marcus laughed. It was real, unguarded and genuine, and it broke something open in the air between them. released the weight of 32 years of distance in a way that nothing formal ever could have. "Show me the barn," Marcus said. They walked out to the site together. Marcus said nothing while he looked at the footprint, at the remaining foundation stones, at the multiple ignition points that were still evident even now to anyone who knew what to look for. He crouched down at one point and touched the edge of the char, and Caleb watched him take in the information the same way he had always taken in information, quietly, completely without comment until he had the whole picture. Finally, he stood. "Professional," Marcus said. "Not a couple of guys with a gas can. Someone knew what they were doing." "That's what the fire chief said," which means Holston's used these people before. Marcus turned to face Caleb. "This wasn't improvised. He had a team ready to go." "Which supports what Gerald documented," Caleb said. 4 other properties over 3 years. Same pattern, same result. Marcus looked at him steadily. "Caleb, this man is running an organized criminal enterprise. What happened to your barn? This isn't a civil dispute over land. This is arson, extortion, and fraud across multiple victims in multiple years." "I know. This needs to be federal." "I know that too," Caleb said. "But to get federal attention, we need a complete picture. The sheriff's investigation alone isn't going to get there. Brooks is capable, but his resources are limited, and Holston has local political cover. We need everything Gerald has. We need the property records Leanne can access, and we need to connect it all in a way that no one can dismiss." He looked at Marcus. "And we need to keep the remaining victims safe while we do it." Marcus held his gaze. The remaining victims. If he's done this to 4 farms before mine, there are probably other properties in the quarter he still has his eye on. If he feels pressure, if he figures out that I'm not folding, his next move might be to accelerate, hit another property buy, another frightened family out fast, and consolidate his position before anyone can put a case together. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Then who's next on the corridor?" "Gerald's farm," Caleb said. "His property is directly in the right-of-way. He's received 2 letters from Holston in the last 6 months. Something shifted in Marcus's expression, not surprise, calculation. He knew. Gerald knew, Caleb confirmed. He knew he was probably on the list. He came to my barn fire at midnight and then came back the next morning with his notebook and his daughter's name because he'd been sitting on this information for 2 years, afraid of exactly what happened to Pete Delaney. He was waiting for something to change. Caleb paused. "I think he was waiting for someone to come." "He should have said something sooner," Marcus said with a note in his voice that wasn't quite anger, but was in that neighborhood. "He was alone," Caleb said, "and afraid. And he watched Pete Delaney lose everything and get called a coward for selling. People don't talk when they're afraid and ashamed and alone." He held Marcus's gaze. "You know what changes that?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "People who come when no one else does," he said. "Yes," Caleb said. They stood in the ash in the afternoon light, and the weight of what they were both understanding settled around them, like the kind of silence that only comes after something important has been said. "All right," Marcus said. "We need to meet everyone together tonight." Bam. By 7 o'clock that evening, 12 men were seated around Caleb's kitchen, overflowing into the living room, and the house that had been almost unbearably quiet since Rachel died was full of voices and the smell of coffee and the low-level electric quality of people who have gathered for a serious purpose and are ready to get to work. Gerald Pwitt arrived at 7:15. He walked in the door, looked around at the 12 men filling his neighbor's kitchen, and stood very still for a moment. Caleb was beside him immediately. "Gerald, these are the people I told you about." Gerald looked at Marcus, who had stood when he came in. Marcus extended his hand. "Mr. Pwitt, Caleb told me what you've been keeping track of for the last 2 years. That took courage." Gerald shook his hand slowly. "Didn't feel like courage," he said. "Felt like not knowing what else to do." "Sometimes that's the same thing," Marcus said. Gerald's daughter, Leanne, arrived 20 minutes later. She was 44 with her father's steady eyes and a sharpness in her face that spoke of someone who had spent years working with documents and numbers and had learned to read what they were really saying. She had brought her laptop, which told Caleb she had already started pulling records before she arrived. She sat down across from Marcus, opened her laptop, and said without preamble, "I've been looking at Mountain Corridor Development LLC since my father called me 2 days ago. They've purchased 11 properties in the Silver Creek corridor over the past 4 years. 7 of those purchases happened within 6 weeks of a reported fire equipment failure or vandalism incident on the property." The room went quiet. "7," Marcus repeated. 7, Leanne said. Not 4, Mr. Dawson, 7. 3 of the victims either didn't know each other or were too embarrassed to mention it publicly. I only found them because the county transfer records show the pattern. She pulled up a document on her screen. Every single sale routed through Mountain Quarter Development, LLC, which is registered in Delaware but has a registered agent in Billings. That agent's address is a law firm. The law firm's primary client list, which is public record at the state bar level, includes Holston Development Group. Caleb looked at her steadily. That's a paper trail. It's the beginning of one, Leanne said. It's enough to support a federal fraud investigation if the right person sees it. But here's the thing. She paused and something in her expression shifted. I was pulling those records at the county assessor's office this afternoon. I pulled them on my work terminal. That means there's a log of the search. You think someone monitors those searches? Marcus asked. I think Victor Holston has enough political relationships in this county that someone might tell him a county employee was running searches on Mountain Quarter Development and linking them to property transfers. She looked around the room. I might have moved us up his timeline. He might already know someone is looking. The room absorbed this. Tommy Briggs from his seat by the window spoke first. How long to get that information to federal investigators? That's not the problem, Leanne said. The problem is that federal investigators move slowly. If Holston figures out someone's looking, he moves fast. He's demonstrated that. She met Caleb's eyes. He burned your barn the same night his man visited your porch. There was no waiting, no escalation. He went straight to maximum pressure. Because it's worked before, Caleb said. Because it's worked before, Leanne agreed. If he feels cornered now, I don't know what the next step looks like. But I know it won't be a letter. Gerald had been listening from the doorway of the kitchen with his arms folded across his chest. He had a quality of stillness that Caleb had always respected. Gerald didn't speak until he had something worth saying. My farm, Gerald said. Everyone looked at him. If he moves faster, my farm is the obvious target, Gerald said. His voice was steady, matter-of-fact, with the particular calm of a man who has been carrying a fear for a long time and has finally decided to say it out loud. My land is directly in the corridor. I've had 2 letters. He knows I'm close to Caleb. He looked at Marcus. If he wants to send a message that none of this is going to work, he burns my place next. Nobody in the room argued with this. The math was plain. Marcus looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Gerald. That's not going to happen, Caleb said. Gerald met his eyes. You can't promise that. I can promise that if he tries, he won't be doing it to a man alone, Caleb said. That's what changes. Marcus turned to Tommy. We split, half here, half at Gerald's. Rotating watches, no gaps starting tonight. Tommy nodded once, no discussion required. Marcus turned back to Leanne. The records you pulled, is there anything connecting Holston personally, not the shell company, not the law firm, Holston himself? Leanne hesitated for the first time. There's one thing, she said. I wasn't sure whether to bring it up because it's one data point and I can't verify it independently. Tell me, Marcus said. One of the 7 property transfers I found the Kellerman farm 18 months ago. The deed transfer paperwork has an error. A small one. A reference number that links back to a document in Holston Development Group's name rather than Mountain Corridor's name. It looks like a clerical mistake. She paused. Or it looks like someone used the wrong template and didn't catch it. The room was very quiet. That link, Marcus said slowly, puts Holston's name directly on a transaction that was supposed to be anonymous. It does, Leanne said, and this is in public records. County deed records, public record. Anyone can pull it. She looked at Marcus steadily. I just happened to be looking carefully enough to notice it. Caleb felt something settle in him, not satisfaction, not yet, but the sense that a door had opened where a wall had been. Victor Holston had spent years building a system designed to be invisible. Shell companies' law firms carefully maintained distance between his name and the criminal activity that had made him rich. He had been meticulous, but meticulous people made mistakes when they scaled up their operations, when they got comfortable, when success bred the particular carelessness that came from years of never facing consequences. One template error, one reference number on one deed. It was thin, but it was real, and real was something to build from. Leanne, Caleb said, I need you to pull everything connected to the Kellerman transfer. Every document with that reference number. Everything. I was planning to, she said, But I can't do it from my work terminal now that I've flagged myself. I need access to the county records system from another source. Can you do it remotely? If I use my personal credentials through the VPN, but those credentials leave a log too. Then we have a narrow window, Marcus said, before anyone who might be watching those logs reports back to Holston. Tonight, Leanne said. If I do it tonight. Marcus looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Leanne Pruitt, at her steady hands on the laptop, at the resolution in her face, at the fact that she had driven over here tonight, already knowing what she might be walking into, because Gerald was her father. And she understood that what had happened to Pete Delaney's wife, what had happened to Caleb's barn, was not something that could be documented and then set aside. Tell me what you need, Caleb said. Time, she said, and someone to sit here while I work, because I'd rather not do this alone. You're not alone, Gerald said from the doorway. And for the first time all evening, there was something in his voice that wasn't careful or controlled. Something that came from a father watching his daughter do something brave in a room full of people who would stand in front of her if they had to. Leanne opened a new window on her laptop and started pulling records. The kitchen went quiet except for the sound of keys, and outside across the property and down the road at Gerald Pruitt's farm, men who had driven 12 hours to be here without being asked twice took up their positions in the dark and waited. Victor Holston had burned a barn thinking he was ending something. He had started something instead. And tonight in a farmhouse kitchen in Silver Creek, Montana, the evidence that was going to prove it was being assembled one document at a time. Leanne worked for 4 hours straight. She didn't ask for coffee, didn't ask for breaks, didn't look up from her screen, except to confirm a document number with her father, or ask Caleb a clarifying question about the timeline. The kitchen around her had settled into the particular quiet of people who understand that the most important thing happening in the room right now is happening on that laptop, and the best thing they can do is stay out of the way of it. Marcus sat at the far end of the table with Tommy Briggs and two of the other writers speaking low, going over logistics. 3 men were rotating watch outside. 2 more were at Gerald's farm down the road. The operation had a shape now, and Caleb recognized the shape. It was the shape of people who had learned over many years in many situations how to move around a problem efficiently without making it worse. He sat beside Leanne and watched her work. She moved through the county record system with the ease of someone who had spent 20 years in those documents, pulling transfer records, cross-referencing reference numbers, following the thread of that single clerical error on the Kellerman deed through every connected transaction she could find. Each time she found something, she saved it to a folder on her personal drive and noted the document number on a legal pad beside the laptop. At 11:43, she stopped typing. She stared at her screen for a long moment without moving. Leanne, Caleb said. There's a second error, she said quietly. Her voice had changed. It had the careful, controlled quality of someone who has just found something bigger than they were expecting and is working to stay steady in front of it. On the Reyes property transfer, 14 months ago, she turned the laptop so Caleb could see the screen. Same reference number, same template, and this one has a signature block. Caleb leaned forward and looked at the document. At the bottom of the deed transfer in the signature line, designated for the buyer's authorized representative, was a name he recognized. Not Victor Holston, someone else entirely. Who is Raymond Cutler? Caleb asked. Victor Holston's brother-in-law, Leanne said. He's a county commissioner, District 3. She looked at Caleb with eyes that had gone very still. He sits on the infrastructure committee, the committee that approved the highway expansion corridor routing. The kitchen went absolutely silent. Marcus had heard it from the end of the table. He was on his feet now, moving toward them without hurrying, the way he moved when something had just changed the entire shape of a situation and he needed to be close to it. Say that again, Marcus said. Leanne said it again, every word exactly. Marcus looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Marcus. Between them passed the understanding of men who have seen corruption before and know what it looks like when it goes all the way up. He routed the highway through the corridor, Caleb said slowly. His brother-in-law buys the land cheaply before the routing is public. Then the highway project inflates the value of everything Holston holds. And anyone who refuses to sell gets burned out, Marcus said. That's why the local political cover was so solid, Caleb said. It wasn't just connections, it was family. The man approving the infrastructure is the man whose family is profiting from it, Tommy Briggs said from across the room quietly. That's not just fraud, that's public corruption. That's federal, Marcus said. Gerald Pwitt had straightened in his chair by the wall. His face had the look of a man who has spent 2 years carrying a weight and has just discovered the weight was even heavier than he knew. Raymond Cutler, he said, I've known that man for 15 years. He spoke at the Silver Creek 4th of July 2 years in a row. He shook my hand. People who do this kind of thing usually shake a lot of hands, Caleb said. Gerald absorbed that. His jaw worked for a moment. Then he was still again. Leanne, Marcus said, can you pull everything connected to Cutler's name in those records? I'm already doing it, she said, and she had turned the laptop back and was working again before Marcus finished the sentence. Caleb refilled his coffee, and stood at the kitchen window, looking out at the dark field. The apple trees along the east fence were invisible in the dark, but he knew exactly where they were. He could close his eyes and trace every row. Raymond Cutler. He turned the name over in his mind, fitting it against everything he had known and suspected. The highway corridor hadn't just accidentally routed through the most fertile farmland in the county. Someone had drawn that line deliberately, knowing exactly which properties it would touch and what would happen to the people who owned them. Old farmers, Gerald had said, all older, all solo operations, because older farmers were less likely to have the energy or resources to fight, because solo operations meant no business partners to push back, because isolated people frighten people without anyone to call, they fold. Victor Holston had understood that. Raymond Cutler had understood that. They had built a system that counted on the isolation of vulnerable people the way an accountant counts on a predictable variable. Caleb thought about Pete Delaney's wife running out of the laundry room. He thought about 7 families. He thought about the particular shame Gerald had described in Pete's voice when he called to say he'd signed. He set his coffee cup down carefully. He was going to make sure that Victor Holston and Raymond Cutler answered for every single one of those families. Not just for what they'd done to him, for every person they had counted on being too alone to fight back. At 2 in the morning, Leanne printed everything she had to the PDF files on her drive and sat back in her chair and pressed both hands against her face for a moment. Okay, she said, dropping her hands. Okay, here's what we have. She had everyone's attention immediately. 11 properties in the corridor, 7 with documented incidents preceding the sale, 2 deed transfer documents with errors that link Mountain Corridor Development, LLC, directly to Holston Development Group. 1 deed transfer with Raymond Cutler's signature on behalf of the buyer entity. She paused. And I found this in the last hour. She turned the laptop screen outward. A planning commission agenda from 28 months ago. Raymond Cutler was listed as a recusal on a vote regarding the highway corridor routing because of, quote, a potential conflict of interest. He recused himself from the vote, but the record shows he participated in 3 preliminary discussions that shaped the options presented to the committee. He recused himself from the vote, but steered the decision before it got to the vote, Marcus said, which is arguably worse than just voting on it, Leanne said, because it's designed to look like he followed procedure. Tommy Briggs made a sound under his breath that wasn't quite words. This is a case, Caleb said. He wasn't asking. This is the beginning of a case, Leanne said carefully. It's compelling, it's documented, but county records are only part of the picture. Financial records, communications, Holston's internal documents, those need subpoena power, which means federal investigators. How do we get this in front of federal investigators without it going through local channels first? Marcus asked. There's a FBI field office in Billings, Leanne said. They have a public corruption unit. If someone walks in with documentation like this, they'll listen, Marcus said. They should listen, Leanne said, but there's a timing problem. She looked around the room. Right now, we've been careful. My search logs at the county office will show someone pulled these records, but unless someone is actively monitoring that system and reporting to Holston tonight, there might be a lag, a day, maybe 2. Her eyes moved to Caleb. But if Holston's people figure out what we've found before we get this to federal investigators, he has the means and the demonstrated willingness to destroy evidence and intimidate witnesses. Or worse, Gerald said from his chair by the wall. No one argued with Gerald. Someone needs to go to Billings, Caleb said. Tonight, Marcus said. It wasn't a question or a suggestion. Tonight, Caleb confirmed. Marcus looked at me. Tommy was already standing. I'll drive, Tommy said. Who goes with me? Caleb looked at Leanne. Can you make a copy of everything and write up a summary, clear sequence simple enough that an investigator can follow it without knowing the county record system? I've been writing it as I went, Leanne said. She tapped the legal pad beside her laptop. 12 pages of notes in her clear, organized handwriting. Give me 40 minutes. She had it done in 35. Tommy Briggs and a rider named Cole left for Billings at 2:58 in the morning with Leanne's documentation on a USB drive and her legal pad summary sealed in an envelope. Tommy had contacts, not federal contacts, but the kind of adjacent contacts that a man in his position accumulated over decades. People who knew people who could get something in front of the right desk without it sitting in a standard intake queue for a week. Caleb stood on the porch and watched their taillights disappear down the main road. Marcus came and stood beside him. For a while, neither of them said anything. He's going to find out, Caleb said finally. Holston, maybe not tonight, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. I know, Marcus said. When he does, his first instinct is going to be to run. Maybe, Marcus said, or his first instinct is going to be to go harder. Make an example. Demonstrate that even with all this, he can still make people pay for coming after him. He paused. Men like him, they don't always run. Sometimes they double down because doubling down has always worked before. Caleb thought about that. He thought about the man in the clean jacket standing at the bottom of his porch steps, smiling the smile that didn't reach his eyes. That was a man who had delivered that speech before, many times, who had watched people fold every single time. He's going to come after someone, Caleb said. Yes, Marcus said. The question is who and when. Gerald's farm, Caleb said. Same answer as before. He hits Gerald, he destroys potential witnesses, he sends a message, and he buries the evidence trail under more immediate crises. Marcus was quiet for a moment. I've got 4 men there. I trust them. I trust them too, Caleb said, but I want to be there. Marcus looked at him. Caleb, I'm not asking permission, Caleb said mildly. I'm telling you where I'll be. Marcus held his gaze for a moment. Then the corner of his mouth moved. You haven't changed, he said. I've changed plenty, Caleb said. The parts that matter are the same. He drove to Gerald's farm at 4 in the morning, Marcus riding behind him, and they found the 4 riders exactly where they were supposed to be, positioned with clear sight lines to the access points, alert communicating in short, efficient intervals. 2 of them Caleb had spoken with briefly in the kitchen the night before. The other 2 he had only seen at a distance. All 4 of them had given up a week of their lives to drive to a small Montana town to protect a man they had never met because Marcus Walker had asked them. Gerald was awake. He met Caleb at the door with the look of a man who had not slept and was not planning to. You should sleep, Caleb said. So should you, Gerald said. They went inside and sat at Gerald's kitchen table in the dark, not bothering with lights, and Gerald made coffee, and they drank it, and neither of them pretended that sleep was a realistic option. I want to ask you something, Gerald said after a while. All right, what was it like before this? He gestured vaguely, not at the farm, not at Silver Creek, but at the whole of Caleb's present life. The other life. What was it actually like? Caleb looked at his coffee for a long moment. It wasn't a question he had answered in 30 years. Redirected it, simply not responded to it the few times anyone had come close enough to ask. But Gerald Pewitt was sitting in his kitchen at 4 in the morning because he had trusted Caleb with a notebook he'd been hiding for 2 years, because he had trusted him with his daughter, because he had opened his door to 14 people he'd never met and stood there in the firelight of a burned barn and said he was afraid and ashamed and that he should have spoken sooner. That deserved an honest answer. It was purposeful, Caleb said finally. That's the word I'd use. Not easy, not safe, not something I'd recommend to anyone who had another option. He paused. But purposeful. There was always something at stake, always someone who needed something, and the thing between them and what they needed was people who were willing to show up. I was willing to show up. He looked at Gerald. Rachel was the one who helped me understand that you could have purpose without that particular kind of cost, that you could build something instead of just defending something. He was quiet for a moment. She was right, and I had 26 good years learning how right she was. Gerald was quiet. But the capacity doesn't go away, Caleb said. It just waits. And when something like this happens, when someone threatens what you built, when you find out they've been doing it to other people for years, the capacity comes back up. And it's different now because I have something to protect That matters more than anything I had back then. He said as calm me down. Rachel's trees are still standing along that east fence. The house we built together is still there. And now I know 7 families who lost what we almost lost, and a man named Pete Delaney who was ashamed of something he had no reason to be ashamed of. He looked at Gerald steadily. That's what I'm protecting, all of it. Gerald was quiet for a long time. Then I should have called someone sooner. You called when you could, Caleb said. That's all any of us can do. The call came at 6:41 in the morning. Not from Tommy, not from Marcus, from Sheriff Daniel Brooks. Caleb picked up on the second ring. Mr. Dawson. Brooks's voice was different from their last conversation, tighter with an urgency underneath it that the careful sheriff had not shown before. I need you to come to my office this morning. Now, if possible. What happened? A pause that lasted just a beat too long. I got a visit last night, after hours. 2 men from a law firm in Billings. They handed me filing a civil complaint against you and several unnamed parties for harassment, property trespass, and interference with a legitimate business operation. Another pause. The filing is on behalf of Victor Holston. Caleb was very still. He's filing on me, Caleb said. He filed at midnight, Brooks said. Emergency filing. His lawyers went to the judge at home. There was something in Brooks's voice now that was not quite anger, but was in the same territory. The controlled frustration of a careful man who has just watched someone use the legal system as a weapon in front of him. Judge Harmon signed a temporary restraining order. It's broad, Mr. Dawson. It prohibits you from contacting or approaching any employees, contractors, or business associates of Holston Development Group. It also, Brooks stopped for a moment, it also names you as a potential accessory to criminal activity for housing individuals with alleged criminal histories on your property. The kitchen was very quiet. Gerald had heard enough from Caleb's side of the conversation to know something had shifted, and he was watching Caleb's face with the attention of someone trying to read weather. He's trying to get us arrested, Caleb said. He's trying to create a legal pretext, Brooks said carefully. The TRO isn't an arrest, but violation of it would be, and his lawyer structured it broadly enough that some of the people currently on your property, if they have prior records. What are you telling me, Sheriff? A long pause. Then, with the deliberate weight of a man who has made a decision he's been building toward, for a while, I'm telling you that Victor Holston has a judge in his pocket and knows how to use the legal system to slow down an investigation. I'm also telling you that he filed this at midnight, which means he found out something was happening and moved faster than I expected. Brooks's voice was level. And I'm telling you that I've been sitting on my desk for the past 2 hours looking at the evidence from your fire and thinking about the pattern that's sitting right in front of me that I should have seen 2 years ago, and I'm angry, Mr. Dawson. I'm angry in a way that is going to make me do my job extremely carefully and extremely thoroughly from this point forward. Caleb closed his eyes briefly, opened them. Sheriff Brooks, he said, there is documentation en route to the FBI field office in Billings right now. Property transfer records, deed errors directly connecting Holston Development Group to Mountain Corridor Development, LLC, and a signature from Raymond Cutler on a buyer document. Silence on the other end of the phone. Absolute silence. Raymond Cutler, Brooks said. He sat on the infrastructure committee, Caleb said. He helped route the highway corridor. His brother-in-law's company bought the land. The silence stretched 5 full seconds. How solid is this documentation? Brooks asked carefully. County deed records, Caleb said. Public record. Anyone can pull it. We pulled it. Another silence. Then very quietly, he's going to know you sent that documentation. He already knows something is happening, Caleb said. That's why the midnight filing, which means he's going to move. Brooks's voice had gone tight in a new way. Cutler has connections at the federal level too, not as strong as his county connections, but enough to slow things down. If Holston and Cutler figure out exactly what's in that documentation before it lands on the right desk, that's why it went last night, Caleb said, before they could respond. A long exhale on the other end of the line. Come to my office, Brooks said. Bring whoever you need to bring. And Mr. Dawson, he paused. I'm going to need to make some calls of my own this morning. Good, Caleb said. He hung up and looked at Gerald. Holston filed a legal action against me at midnight, Caleb said. He has a TRO, a restraining order broad enough to potentially expose anyone on my property with a prior record to arrest. Gerald's face had gone very still. He knows we found something, Caleb said. He moved fast, and he moved legally, which means he's trying to use the system to stop this before it gets to people he can't control. Can he? Not if Brooks makes the calls he just implied he's going to make, Caleb said. And not if Tommy got that documentation in front of the right person in Billings before the midnight filing gave Holston's lawyers time to make calls of their own. He stood. I need to wake Marcus. Marcus took the news with the stillness of a man who had been in enough bad situations to know that the moment things go sideways is the exact moment to get slower and more deliberate, not faster and more reactive. The TRO, he said, tell me exactly what it covers. Caleb told him what Brooks had described. Marcus listened, thought. It names me, unnamed parties with alleged criminal histories, which in a county where the judge is friendly to the filer could mean whatever their lawyers want it to mean. Then we have a narrow window, Marcus said. If Holston's lawyers file an amended TRO naming individuals, anyone with a record is potentially looking at arrest if they're on your property. He looked around at the room. Some of his riders had records. Not violent felonies, mostly old charges from younger years, the kind that followed people without defining them, but charges that a motivated lawyer with a friendly judge could use. I'm not asking anyone to leave, Caleb said immediately. This is my fight and nobody's leaving, Marcus said flatly. Let me be clear about that. But I need to know who's exposed and move them to positions that aren't technically your property. He looked at Tommy, who had just walked in the door from the Billings Drive road, worn but alert. How'd it go? Tommy sat down. He looked at Caleb first, then at Marcus. I got it to someone I trust, he said. Public Corruption Unit, FBI Billings. My contact said she'd get it to the right person by morning briefing. He paused. She also said, and this matters, that if what's in there is accurate, it's the kind of thing that gets priority. Because public corruption involving an elected official supersedes a lot of other things on the list. How quickly? Marcus asked. She didn't know, Tommy said. Days, not weeks. Maybe faster if the documentation is as clean as it looked to her when I described it. Caleb looked at him. She looked at it. I summarized it. She listened for about 4 minutes and then told me to get the physical documentation to the office by 8 a.m. and ask for her by name. Tommy put both hands on the table. It's in. It's real. Now we wait for them to move. While Holston moves first, Marcus said. While Holston moves first, Tommy agreed. The room was quiet for a moment. Then a phone buzzed on the table. Not Caleb's. One of the riders who had been on watch outside had come in, and his phone was on the table, and it was buzzing with a text from one of the men still out there. He read it. His face changed. Marcus, he said. Marcus looked at him. 3 trucks just turned off the county road toward Gerald's property from the north access. Every person in that kitchen went completely still for exactly 1 second. Then Marcus was moving. Who's at Gerald's? He said already through the doorway. Davis, Chen, and Reyes, Tommy said right behind him. Are they covered? They're covered. Tell them to hold position. Do not engage. Document everything. Marcus was pulling out his phone as he moved. Caleb, call Brooks right now. Tell him Victor Holston's people are moving on the Pwitt property and you need law enforcement on the scene immediately. Caleb was already dialing. Gerald Pwitt had stood up from his chair at the first word of trucks on his property, and he was standing in the middle of his kitchen with his hands at his sides and an expression on his face that Caleb had never seen on him before. And before not, here's something. Harder and more resolved than fear, the expression of a man who has been afraid for 2 years and has just decided he is finished being afraid. That's my farm, Gerald said. I know, Caleb said. They're not burning my farm. They're not burning your farm, Caleb said. And the certainty in his voice was not reassurance. It was a statement of fact delivered with the quiet authority of a man who has spent his entire adult life turning statements like that into truth. Brooks answered on the second ring. They're moving on Gerald Pwitt's property right now, Caleb said. 3 trucks north access road. I need deputies on scene immediately. A sound on the other end of the line, boots movement, an immediate shift in background noise. I'm rolling now, Brooks said. Keep your people calm, Caleb. Do not let anyone touch those trucks. Understood. I mean it. If your people are the ones who make physical contact, Holston's midnight filing turns into something I can't help you with. I understand the line, Caleb said. Nobody touches anything. Document and hold. He hung up and looked at Marcus. Marcus met his eyes. You trust Brooks? I trust that he's angry, Caleb said. Right now, that's enough. Outside down the county road at Gerald Pwitt's farm, 3 trucks had stopped at the edge of the property line. Not moving forward, stopped. Because there were 3 men already there when they arrived. 3 men who had spent all night in position, who were now standing in plain sight on the Pwitt property line, not moving, not speaking, not threatening, just present, visible. Witnesses. The trucks idled for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Then they turned around and drove back the way they had come. Chen texted the update from the property line they left. Got plates on all 3. Marcus read it and exhaled through his nose. They tested it, Tommy said. Saw people in position and pulled back. They pulled back this time, Marcus said. That's not the same as stopped. I was right. Caleb knew he was right. Victor Holston had spent years burning barns and buying land and walking away clean. He had a judge, he had a brother-in-law on the infrastructure committee, and he had the bone-deep confidence of a man who had never faced real consequences. 3 trucks pulling back from a property line wasn't surrender. It was recalculation. The next move would be different. Smarter or more desperate, depending on what Holston knew and how frightened he was. Sheriff Brooks arrived at the Pwitt property 30 minutes later with 2 deputies. He looked at the tire tracks from the 3 trucks, looked at the written log Chen had kept with timestamps and plate numbers, and stood quietly for a moment. Then he looked at Caleb. Those plates, he said, 2 of them are registered to a contractor out of Billings who has done work for Holston Development Group. He said it with the specific controlled tone of a man announcing that he has just found the piece of evidence he was waiting for. That connects Holston directly to an attempted intimidation visit during an active criminal investigation. Is that enough? Gerald asked. It's enough for me to make some very specific phone calls, Brooks said, including one to the FBI field office in Billings. He looked at Caleb. I understand some documentation arrived there this morning. Caleb held his gaze. I believe that's correct. Brooks looked at him for a long moment, the long assessing look of a careful man recalibrating what he knows about another careful man. You were 2 steps ahead of this the whole time, he said quietly. I was trying to be, Caleb said. The TRO, Brooks said, his lawyers are going to push on it today. I know. You need your own legal representation today. I know that too. Brooks looked around at Marcus, at the riders standing in various positions around the property at Gerald Pwitt, standing on his own land, with the expression of a man who has been protected for the first time in years. Something moved across the sheriff's face, something that wasn't quite respect and wasn't quite regret, but was related to both of them. I should have put this together 2 years ago, he said quietly. You didn't have what you needed 2 years ago, Caleb said. I didn't look hard enough. Maybe, Caleb said, but you're looking now, and right now is when it matters. Brooks held his gaze for another moment. Then he nodded once and walked back to his cruiser to make the calls he had said he was going to make. Marcus came and stood beside Caleb as the cruiser pulled out onto the county road. It's moving, Marcus said. It's moving, Caleb agreed. Holston's going to feel it soon. The pressure from the federal side. The plates connecting his contractors to the Pwitt visit. The sheriff making calls. Marcus paused. That's when cornered people do something stupid. Caleb looked at him. Or something dangerous. The 2 usually go together. They stood on Gerald Pwitt's property in the morning light, and the apple trees that Gerald's wife had planted along the south fence threw long shadows across the yard, and somewhere down the county road, the trucks with the Billings plates were reporting back to Victor Holston that the old farmer's property had people on it who weren't moving, and in a hotel room in Billings, or an office, or wherever. Victor Holston was sitting right now. A man who had never lost was beginning to understand for the first time in his life what it felt like when the ground shifted underneath him. He had burned a barn thinking he was ending something. He was only now beginning to understand what he had started instead. Victor Holston made his first public move at 9:17 that morning. Caleb was sitting in Brooks's office when the sheriff's desk phone rang, and the deputy outside picked it up and knocked on the door 30 seconds later, with the particular expression of someone delivering news they know is going to change the temperature of the room. Press call for you, Sheriff, the deputy said. Regional outlet out of Billings. They're saying they have a statement from Holston Development Group about ongoing harassment by organized criminal elements targeting legitimate business operations in Silver Creek County. Brooks looked at the deputy, then at Caleb, then back at the deputy. Tell them I'm unavailable, Brooks said. and document the call time. The deputy left. Brooks leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment with the expression of a man mentally rearranging everything he thought he knew about how the next 48 hours were going to go. He's going to the press, Caleb said. He's controlling the story before we can, Brooks said. Classic. If the first thing people read is that a motorcycle gang is harassing a legitimate developer, then everything that comes out after our investigation, the federal documentation, it all gets filtered through that frame. He dropped his gaze from the ceiling. He's done this before. Not here, but somewhere. Nobody pivots that fast without a playbook. He's scared, Caleb said. Scared and smart, Brooks said. That combination is more dangerous than either one alone. Caleb's phone buzzed. A text from Marcus Check, local news. It's already running. He showed Brooks the screen. The sheriff pulled up the regional news site on his computer. The headline had been up for 11 minutes. Developer alleges organized intimidation by motorcycle gang in rural Montana dispute. Below it was a photograph not of Holston, not of the burned barn, but of 3 of Marcus's riders standing at the Poet property line from that morning, taken from a distance, framed in a way that made 3 men standing still look menacing. Someone had been out there with a camera before Brooks arrived. He had a photographer on the county road, Caleb said quietly. He was ready for this morning, Brooks said. He knew his trucks were going to the Poet property, and he sent someone ahead to document whatever response they found. He looked at Caleb with the eyes of a man who has just revised upward his estimate of an opponent. He wanted them to pull back. He wanted the photograph of your people standing there. Caleb felt the logic of it settle into place, and it was elegant and ugly in equal measure. Send the trucks. Let them be turned back by visible presence. Photograph the visible presence. Publish it before anyone else can publish anything. Frame the story as a developer being intimidated by a gang, not a farmer being victimized by a criminal enterprise. It was a good move. It would have been a better move if the FBI hadn't already had Tommy's documentation for 4 hours. I need to make a call, Caleb said. Brooks gestured at the door. Caleb stepped into the hallway, found a quiet corner, and called Marcus. I saw it, Marcus said before Caleb could speak. He wanted the photographs, Caleb said. I know. I've been thinking about it since the trucks turned around and it felt too easy. Marcus's voice was controlled, but with a current of something underneath it. Not anger, something more focused than anger. He's good at this. He knew that visible presence was a liability, and he turned it into an asset inside 2 hours. It only works if he controls the story, Caleb said. The moment federal investigators become visible in this, the narrative shifts. A legitimate developer being harassed by bikers becomes a criminal enterprise being investigated by the FBI. How long until that happens? I don't know. Brooks is calling his federal contact today. Tommy's documentation is already in. But these things move at their own pace. So we have a gap, Marcus said. Between now and when federal involvement becomes public, Holston owns the story. Yes, a pause. What do you want to do? Caleb had been thinking about this since he saw the headline. He thought about what he had, what Holston didn't know he had, and where the pressure points were. He thought about the 7 families. He thought about Pete Delaney. I want to talk to Pete Delaney, Caleb said. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Gerald's friend, the farmer who sold. He's a witness, Caleb said. He was intimidated, his wife was nearly killed, and he sold under duress. If he's willing to go on record, not to the press, to law enforcement, his testimony connects Holston's pattern directly to documented criminal behavior before my barn ever burned. You think he'll talk? Gerald said he was ashamed when he called to tell him he'd signed. Ashamed people either go quiet forever, or they reach a point where the shame of staying quiet becomes bigger than the shame of what happened to them. Caleb paused. I think Pete Delaney has been waiting for someone to tell him it wasn't his fault. Then go tell him, Marcus said. I'll hold things here. Caleb went back into Brooks's office and told him where he was going. Brooks looked at him carefully. The TRO restricts you from contacting Holston's business associates. Pete Delaney is a retired farmer who sold his land 18 months ago, Caleb said. He's not a Holston business associate. Technically correct, Brooks said slowly. Is it legally correct? Yes, Brooks said. Go. So, Pete Delaney lived in a small rental house on the east side of Silver Creek, the kind of place a man moves to when the farm he spent his life building is gone, and the money from the sale was enough to cover the transition, but not enough to replace what was lost. The house was tidy in the way that people keep things tidy when tidiness is the one variable they can still control. Caleb knocked, waited. The door opened, and Pete Delaney looked at him with the face of a man who had spent 18 months expecting something and wasn't entirely surprised that it had finally arrived. He was 74, a little thinner than the photographs Caleb had seen, with the careful movements of someone who had been through something that cost him more than he'd admitted to anyone. "Mr. Dawson," Pete said. "You know who I am," Caleb said. "Gerald called me yesterday, said your barn burned." Pete looked at him steadily, said you weren't folding. "No," Caleb said, "I'm not." Pete stepped back from the door. "Come in." They sat at Pete's kitchen table, which was smaller than Caleb's, and somehow quieter. And Pete made coffee without asking if Caleb wanted any, which Caleb understood to mean Pete needed the ritual of it more than he needed the answer. "My wife still has nightmares," Pete said when he sat down. He said it to his coffee cup, not to Caleb. "She wakes up at 3 in the morning sometimes, and she's back in that laundry room and the fire is—" He stopped, picked up his cup, set it down. "The doctor says it gets better. It's been 18 months. I'm still waiting for better." Caleb didn't say anything. He let the silence be what it was. "I sold because I was scared," Pete said. "I could dress it up any way I want, but that's what it was. I was scared, and my wife was scared, and I looked at what they were willing to do, and I thought, what comes after the barn? Because they burned the barn and walked away clean, and the sheriff didn't have enough, and the lawyer I talked to said it was going to take years and cost money I didn't have, and even then the outcome wasn't certain." He looked up at Caleb. "So I sold, for less than half of what it was worth. And I called Gerald the night I signed, and he listened, and he didn't say anything. I needed him not to say, and I've been ashamed of it ever since." "You shouldn't be ashamed," Caleb said. "Not for 1 minute. That's easy to say." "No," Caleb said. "It's not easy to say. It's true, and truth is harder than easy." He leaned forward slightly. "You were alone. Your wife had just come out of a burning building. The system that was supposed to protect you told you it couldn't. There was no one to call and nowhere to go, and the people doing this to you knew all of that. They built their whole operation on the fact that people in your position have nowhere to go." He held Pete's eyes. "That's not your failure. That's their design." Pete was quiet for a long moment. "You have somewhere to go now," Caleb said. "That's why I'm here. Not to ask you to fight. Not to put you in any danger. I'm here to tell you that there are federal investigators who have documentation connecting what happened to your farm to a pattern of criminal activity involving a county commissioner and a developer, and that if you're willing to give a formal statement about what happened to you, what was actually done to you and your wife, your testimony becomes part of a federal case." Pete's hands were still around his coffee cup. He didn't move for a long time. "They'll know," he said. "Holston's people. They'll know eventually," Caleb agreed. "But by then this will be in federal hands, not county, not local, federal, which means the political protection Holston has been using stops working. What if it doesn't get that far? What if it stalls?" "It won't stall," Caleb said. "Not anymore. There are too many pieces in too many hands." He paused. "Pete, I'm going to be honest with you because you deserve honest. This is going to get harder before it gets easier. Holston is already fighting back. He went to the press this morning and framed this as bikers harassing a legitimate businessman. He has a lawyer and a judge and connections that he's using right now. This is not going to be clean." Pete absorbed this. His jaw tightened. "But here's what else is true," Caleb said. 7 families, that's what we've documented. 7 families in this quarter who went through what you went through or something close to it. Most of them sold. Some of them might talk. And if they talk, if even half of them are willing to go on record, then what Victor Holston built comes apart completely. Because the difference between one old farmer's complaint and 7 corroborated testimonies in a federal corruption case is the difference between a bump in the road and a wall. Pete looked at him. "I'm one of 7, Pete said slowly. "You're one of at least 7, Caleb said. "Probably more." Something moved across Pete Delaney's face, something that started in his eyes and worked its way down through his expression like a shift in weight. Caleb had seen that look before. The specific look of a person realizing they were not alone in something they had been carrying entirely alone. "My wife," Pete said. "She'd have to know." "Yes," Caleb said. "She's going to be—" He stopped, started again. "She's been wanting to do something since the day we signed. She kept saying we should fight, And I kept telling her we didn't have anything to fight with. His voice had changed. Something hard and purposeful was coming into it. She's going to be the one who says yes before I finish explaining. Caleb looked at him. Then bring her in, he said. She's a witness too. He drove back to Brooks's office with Pete Delaney's phone number and his word that he would call the sheriff that afternoon. He found the office busier than he'd left it, two deputies moving with purpose. Brooks on the phone with his back to the door, and the particular electrical quality of a space where something significant has just happened. Brooks hung up and turned around. He looked at Caleb with an expression that was doing several things at once. FBI confirmed receipt of the documentation, Brooks said. My contact in billing says it's been escalated to the public corruption unit and they've opened a preliminary inquiry. He paused. They also told me something else. What? Raymond Cutler resigned from the county commissioner seat 40 minutes ago. Brooks said it carefully with the precise emphasis of a man who wants to make sure the weight of each word lands correctly. No public statement. His office just issued a resignation letter citing personal reasons. Caleb was very still. He knows, Caleb said. He knows the documentation is in federal hands, Brooks said, which means either someone told him or he found out another way. He looked at Caleb steadily. A man doesn't resign from an elected position in 40 minutes unless he's been told by someone he trusts that the game is over. Holston told him, Caleb said. That's my read. Which means Holston knows exactly what's in that documentation. Yes, Brooks said, which means he knows his paper trail has been compromised and his political cover just walked out the door. He paused. And a man who knows that much has two options. He lawyers up completely and waits for the noose to tighten, or he runs, Caleb said. Or he runs, Brooks confirmed. I've already asked for a flag on his travel. Can you do that without a warrant? I can make a call to the right person who can make a suggestion to the right system, Brooks said, discreetly, legally. He looked at Caleb steadily. There's a lot I should have done 2 years ago, Mr. Dawson. I'm doing it now, all of it. Caleb looked at him. I know, he said, and he meant it without judgment, not as absolution, just as recognition. Brooks hadn't been corrupt. He'd been cautious. There was a difference, and it mattered. His phone buzzed. Marcus. He stepped outside and answered. Holston just called a press conference, Marcus said. 2 hours from now, Silver Creek Community Hall. He's going to make some kind of public statement, and apparently he's invited local press and whatever regional outlets will come. Caleb processed this. He's doubling down. He's going to stand in front of cameras in your town and tell the story his way, Marcus said. With Cutler gone, he can't hide behind political cover anymore. So he's going public, making himself the victim, probably going to talk about property rights harassment, organized crime, small business being threatened. A pause. He's betting that the optics of that, a businessman standing up in the community center versus bikers on a farm, plays better than the evidence. It might, Caleb said, for a few days until the federal investigation becomes public. He knows that, Marcus said, which means he thinks he can either control those few days or use them to get somewhere we can't follow. He's running while he's talking, Caleb said. That's what I think too. Caleb thought for a moment. Fast. He thought about what Holston expected and where the gap between those two things was. I need to be at that press conference, Caleb said. A pause from Marcus. Caleb, not to confront him, not to make a scene, to be present, visible, to let the people of Silver Creek see the man whose barn was burned standing in the same room as the man who burned it. He paused. And to bring Gerald. Why Gerald specifically? Because Gerald Pitt is not a biker, not a prior criminal, not anyone that Holston's narrative can absorb. He's a 71-year-old third-generation farmer with a notebook documenting 2 years of what this man did to this community. If Gerald stands in that room, Caleb stopped. He makes the story real, Marcus said quietly. Yes, and Pete Delaney. If Pete is willing, Caleb said, let him decide. Marcus was quiet for a moment. I'll stay back. My people will stay back. This one needs to be yours. I know, Caleb said, but I'll be close, Marcus said, in case. I know that too, Caleb said. Thank you. The community hall in Silver Creek held about 200 people. By the time Caleb arrived with Gerald Puet and yes, Pete Delaney, who had called his wife, who had said yes before he finished explaining, who was now standing straight and quiet in a suit jacket, he'd worn to his daughter's college graduation. There were perhaps 90 people already inside. Local faces, people Caleb had known for years. Neighbors and townspeople who had read the morning headline and come to see what this was about. They walked in together, the three of them, and found seats near the back. Several people noticed them. Caleb watched it move through the room, a recognition, a murmur, someone touching someone else's arm and nodding in their direction. He held his expression neutral. Gerald sat rigid and steady beside him. Pete Delaney looked at his hands for a moment, then lifted his eyes and kept them up. Victor Holston entered from the side door with two lawyers, a publicist and the clean jacket man from Caleb's porch, who saw Caleb the moment he walked in and went very still before recovering and leaning to say something in Holston's ear. Holston looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at Holston. For the first time, Caleb saw the actual man behind the machine. Victor Holston was 61, well-dressed with the particular polished quality of someone who had spent decades on the right side of power. But underneath that polish, in the set of his jaw and the way his eyes had moved across the room in the first 2 seconds of entering, it was the controlled fear of a man who knows the ground has shifted and is not yet sure how far. I took the podium. He spoke for 9 minutes. He used the words harassment, intimidation, organized criminal elements, and legitimate business rights with the practiced fluency of someone who had workshopped this language carefully. He described the highway expansion as a public good and his acquisition of properties as a legal and fair process. He said he was a victim of a coordinated campaign to extort his business. He did not mention Raymond Cutler. He did not mention the barn. He did not mention Pete Delaney's wife. When he opened for questions, 3 reporters raised their hands. Caleb let the first 2 go. Local questions, soft ones. Holston handled them smoothly. The third reporter was not local. She was a woman in her 40s with a recording device and the focused eyes of someone who had driven from somewhere farther than Silver Creek, because something in a tip she'd received that morning had interested her significantly. Caleb did not know her name. He found out later she worked for a regional investigative outlet out of Missoula that covered public corruption and land use issues across Montana. She had, Caleb also found out later, been forwarded a summary of Leanne's documentation by Tommy Briggs's FBI contact that morning. Not the full documentation, just enough to know what questions to ask. Mr. Holston, she said, can you explain the relationship between Holston Development Group and Mountain Corridor Development, LLC, specifically regarding the 7 property acquisitions in the Silver Creek corridor that preceded documented fire and vandalism incidents on those properties? The room went very quiet. Victor Holston's expression didn't collapse. He was too controlled for that, but something behind his eyes changed in a way that the 90 people watching could feel without being able to name it. I'm not familiar with the entity you're describing, he said. Mountain Corridor Development, LLC, she repeated. Registered in Delaware with a registered agent at a Billings law firm whose primary client is your company. I'd need to refer any questions about specific business entities to my legal team, Holston said. Of course. Can your legal team explain why Raymond Cutler's signature appears on a deed transfer document on behalf of that entity, Commissioner Cutler, who resigned from the county commission this morning? Holston's lawyer put a hand on his arm. Holston shook it off, a reflex, a tell the action of a man whose control is fraying at the exact edge where he doesn't want it to fray publicly. This press conference is about the harassment of my company, Holston said. I'm not going to be derailed by Mr. Holston. A different voice. From the back of the room. People turned. Gerald Pwitt had stood up. He stood with his hands at his sides and his chin level, in the particular dignity of a man who has worked the same land for 50 years and knows exactly who he is. His voice was not loud. It didn't need to be. I'm Gerald Pwitt, he said. I farmed 3/4 of a mile east of Caleb Dawson's property. Your company has sent me 2 letters in the past 6 months. He paused. I have a notebook. It has dates, names, and descriptions of what happened to 7 families in this corridor. People I know, people you targeted. He looked directly at Victor Holston across the 90 people between them. I've had it for 2 years. I didn't know what to do with it. I know now. The room was absolutely silent. Holston stared at him. My name is Pete Delaney. Pete's voice came from beside Gerald, steady in a way that Caleb suspected was costing him something significant. You burned out my barn 18 months ago. My wife was inside. She still has nightmares. He paused. I sold my family's land for less than half of what it was worth because I was scared and alone, and I didn't think anyone was coming to help. Another pause. I was wrong about that last part. Someone in the room made a sound, not a gasp, something softer than that. The sound of a room full of people understanding simultaneously that what they had been told they were here to see and what they were actually seeing were completely different things. Holston's publicist said something in his ear. His lawyer said something else. The clean jacket man was already on his phone, turned away from the room. Holston stepped away from the podium. He turned toward the side door. And Caleb, from his seat at the back, watched Victor Holston walk out of his own press conference with the controlled urgency of a teen who has just realized that the room he walked into is not the room he was prepared for. The Missoula reporter was already calling something after him. Other voices were rising. Gerald sat back down and Pete sat beside him, and Caleb put a hand briefly on Pete Delaney's shoulder and felt the man exhale a long, slow exhale, the kind that carries something it's been holding for a very long time. His phone buzzed. Brooks. He stepped outside to take it. Did it go how I think it went? Brooks asked. Holston left his own press conference, Caleb said. A brief silence. Then FBI just called. They want a formal interview with Gerald Pwitt and any additional witnesses by end of week. They're moving. Another brief silence. There's something else. What? Holston's lawyers filed an emergency motion 40 minutes ago to have the TRO expanded, Brooks said. They're trying to get Marcus Walker and his people named specifically and removed from the county entirely. Caleb absorbed this. On what grounds? Criminal history, Brooks said. Specifically a 14-year-old federal conviction for Marcus Walker that was fully served and discharged. He paused carefully. It's aggressive and it's probably not going to succeed, but it creates a legal distraction that costs time and resources to fight. He's trying to pull Marcus into the story, Caleb said. Make it about bikers instead of about fraud. Yes. What do you recommend? Get Marcus a good lawyer in the next 2 hours, Brooks said, and tell him to stay visible but completely legal. No gray areas, no room for Holston's lawyers to work with. Everything clean. I'll tell him. And Caleb, Brooks paused. Good work today. What those two men did in there that mattered. That's going to matter a lot when this gets in front of a federal judge. Caleb didn't answer immediately. He thought about Pete Delaney in his suit jacket from his daughter's graduation. He thought about Gerald Pwitt standing up in a room full of strangers with a voice that didn't waver. It wasn't me, Caleb said. I just gave them a reason. Sometimes that's the whole job, Brooks said. He hung up and stood outside the community hall, while the crowd inside broke into fragments, people talking, the reporter making calls. Holston's legal team huddled by the side door. He called Marcus and told him everything, including the TRO expansion attempt, and heard Marcus take it with the equanimity of a man who has faced legal attacks before and knows how to respond. We'll get the lawyer, Marcus said. It's not going to work. He's desperate. Desperate people do things that careful people don't, Caleb said. I know, Marcus said. I'm watching your property right now. Nothing's moving. A pause. But tonight I want everyone alert. If he's going to do something stupid, it'll be tonight. After the press conference blew up on him, after Cutler walked, after the FBI call, Marcus's voice was quiet and certain. Tonight is when a man who's never lost decides whether he can survive losing. Caleb looked at the pale Montana sky above Silver Creek. He's going to try something, Caleb said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Marcus said simply, he is. And in that moment, standing outside the community hall, where Victor Holston had just walked out of his own press conference, Caleb Dawson felt something that was not satisfaction and not fear, but the particular focused readiness of a man who has spent his whole life, both lives, the one before Rachel and the one with her, understanding that the most dangerous moment is not the beginning of a fight. It's the moment when the person who thought they were winning first understands that they might not be. That was the moment they were in now, and Caleb was ready for it. Marcus was right about the night. It came at 2:43 in the morning, and it did not come the way Caleb expected. No trucks, no headlights on the main road, no sound of engines carrying across the quiet fields the way sound travels in rural Montana when everything else is still. What came instead was a single phone call to Caleb's cell from a number he didn't recognize. And when he answered it, the voice on the other end was not one of Holston's hired men. It was Victor Holston himself. Caleb sat up in the dark and pressed the phone to his ear and said nothing. He waited. Mr. Dawson, Holston's voice was different from anything Caleb had constructed in his imagination. Not the voice of a bully, not the voice of a panicked man. Controlled. Carefully, deliberately controlled in the way that a person speaks when they are managing themselves against a current of emotion that would prefer to surface. I think we should talk. We're talking, Caleb said. Not like this. A pause. I want to meet, just the two of us, tonight. Caleb looked at the ceiling of the bedroom where Rachel's photograph was on the nightstand, and the dark was very complete around him. He thought about what Marcus had said. Desperate people do things that careful people don't. He thought about the shape of a man who had walked out of his own press conference 6 hours ago and had been making calls and calculations ever since. Where? Caleb said. A brief silence, as if Holston had expected resistance and was recalibrating to the absence of it. The diner on Route 12 open all night. Public place. Another pause. I'm not going to do anything stupid, Mr. Dawson. I think we both know the situation has moved past the point where that would help me. I'll be there in 30 minutes, Caleb said. He hung up and called Marcus before he was out of bed. He called you directly, Marcus said, and his voice had the sharpened quality of someone who had not been asleep. None of them had been fully asleep. That's either the most honest thing he's done in this entire situation, or it's the most dangerous. Public place his suggestion, Caleb said. He named it first. I heard you say Route 12 Diner. I'll have 2 people there before you arrive. They'll sit separately, they won't look connected to you, and they will not intervene in anything unless something physical happens. Marcus paused. Nothing physical is going to happen, but I'll have them there. I know, Caleb said. Thank you. Caleb. Marcus's voice shifted, dropped a register. Whatever he says to you in there, whatever he offers you, don't have to decide anything tonight. You hear me? Whatever comes out of his mouth, you can say you'll think about it and walk out the door and call me. Nothing has to be decided at 2 in the morning in a diner. I know that, Caleb said. I'm saying it anyway. I know you are, Caleb said. I'll call you after. He dressed in the dark. He looked at Rachel's photograph for a moment before he left. He didn't say anything this time. He just looked the way you look at something that orients you, that reminds you of the fixed point from which everything else is measured. Then he got in his truck and drove to Route 12. Victor Holston was already there when Caleb arrived, sitting in a corner booth with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched, wearing a jacket but no tie, which on a man like Holston at 3 in the morning meant something had come undone. 2 of Marcus's people were already in the diner. Caleb clocked them immediately, one at the counter, one in a booth near the door, both doing a credible impression of ordinary people who happened to be up late. Caleb slid into the booth across from Holston and looked at him. Up close in the flat fluorescent light of an all-night diner, Victor Holston looked like a man who had aged several years since his press conference photograph. The control was still there. The man was not broken, not yet, but the effort required to maintain it was visible in a way it wouldn't have been 48 hours ago. His eyes were sharp and calculating, and also underneath that, very tired. Thank you for coming, Holston said. Say what you have to say, Caleb said. Holston wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He looked at them for a moment, then back at Caleb. I want to make this right, he said. Caleb waited. Raymond Cutler acted independently, Holston said. The routing of the corridor that was his decision. He came to me with land acquisition opportunities. I took them, and I didn't ask enough questions about how he was identifying them or what was happening on those properties before they came to market. He held Caleb's eyes steadily. I'm not saying I'm innocent of everything. I'm saying there's a distinction between what I knew and what I directed. 7 families, Caleb said. His voice was flat and even and completely without heat. 7 families lost property at below-market prices after fires, vandalism, and direct threats. You acquired every one of those properties through a shell company. Your brother-in-law routed a highway to make them worth 10 times what you paid. I understand how it looks. I'm not talking about how it looks, Caleb said. I'm telling you what it was. Holston was quiet. A woman ran out of a burning laundry room, Caleb said. She still has nightmares. Her husband sold his family's land for less than half of its value because he was alone and scared and there was nobody to call. He let that sit for a moment. What part of that is Raymond Cutler's independent action? Holston's jaw tightened. The control was costing him visibly now. The fires were directed by people working for Cutler, not for me. They drove trucks registered to a contractor on your payroll, Caleb said. A silence. What do you want? Holston said. And the question landed differently than it would have if he'd asked it yesterday. It had the sound of a man asking a real question, not a negotiating position. I already told someone that question, Caleb said. 3 days ago on the phone in the middle of the night. I want justice. I want the kind that sticks and that protects other people from what you did. He looked across at Victor Holston. That's not something you can give me in a diner at 3 in the morning. That's already in motion and it doesn't need your cooperation to get where it's going. Holston looked at him. Then why did you come? Caleb looked back at him steadily. Because I wanted to see you, he said simply. I wanted to sit across from the man who burned my barn and look him in the eyes and know that he understands what he did, not what it cost him legally, what he actually did. Holston was very still. You looked at this county, Caleb said, and you saw a collection of old people on land you wanted, and you calculated that they were powerless, that they were alone, that the right combination of pressure and fear would make them disappear. He paused. You were right about a lot of it. You were right that people are vulnerable when they're isolated. You were right that fear is powerful. You were right that local systems can be slow and imperfect. He leaned forward slightly. You were wrong about one thing. You assumed that isolated meant alone. You assumed that because these people didn't have visible support, they had no support at all. He held Holston's eyes. You were wrong about that. Holston looked at him for a long moment. Something moved across his face that Caleb couldn't entirely read and didn't try to. Whatever was happening inside Victor Holston right now was Victor Holston's business. What mattered was the record, the evidence, and the federal investigation that was already turning its full attention towards Silver Creek, Montana. The FBI is going to contact you within 48 hours, Caleb said. He stood. I'd recommend getting ahead of it however you can. Not for my benefit, for yours. He looked down at Holston in the booth at the untouched coffee and the expensive jacket and the careful face of a man at the precise moment of understanding that his life is dividing into before and after. Whatever you decide to do with what I just said, that's your choice. But the families you hurt deserve to see accountability, and they're going to see it. He left money on the table for coffee he hadn't ordered and walked out into the night air. He stood beside his truck for a moment and breathed. Then he called Marcus. How'd it go? Marcus asked. He wanted to draw a line between himself and Cutler, Caleb said. Blame the routing on Cutler, claim he didn't direct the fires. Do you believe him? Caleb thought about it honestly. I believe the fires were Cutler's specific operation. I believe Holston knew enough to know he was profiting from something he shouldn't have profited from and chose not to look too carefully at how. He paused. The federal investigation will sort the degrees. That's not my job. What did you say to him? I told him what I wanted, which is the same thing it's always been, Caleb said. Justice, the kind that sticks. A pause from Marcus. And I told him to cooperate with the FBI. You think he will? Caleb looked at the dark sky above Route 12 at the stars visible in the Montana dark that never fully appeared in cities. I think Victor Holston has spent his entire life as the most dangerous person in every room he walked into, he said. Tonight, for the first time, he sat across from someone who wasn't afraid of him and wasn't going to be bought and wasn't going to fold. And he felt what that's like from the other side. Another pause. That changes something in a person. Not always enough, but sometimes. Will it matter, Marcus asked. His cooperation. It'll matter to the other families, Caleb said. If he gives up the full picture, names, transactions, communications, the case against Cutler becomes airtight. The families get full restitution, not just partial. Pete Delaney gets the actual value of his land back, not just a settlement. He paused. So yes, it matters. Not to me personally, to them. Marcus was quiet for a moment. You went in there for them, he said. Not for yourself. My barn's already gone, Caleb said simply. What I went in there for is already done. Victor Holston contacted the FBI the following morning. Caleb found out from Brooks, who called at 9:47 with the particular voice of a man delivering news that is better than he expected. Holston had retained separate legal counsel from his company's law firm, a distinction that mattered, and his new attorney had initiated cooperation discussions with the Public Corruption Unit. In exchange for reduced charges and a cooperation agreement, Holston was providing full documentation of the relationship between his company and Mountain Corridor Development, LLC, the communications between himself and Raymond Cutler going back 4 years, and the names of the contractors who had carried out the intimidation operations on the 7 properties. 7 confirmed, Brooks said. Possibly 2 more they're still investigating. How are the families going to be compensated? Caleb asked. That's part of the negotiation, Brooks said. Holston's cooperation agreement includes a restitution fund as a condition. The FBI is insisting on it. The families will be assessed individually property values, documented losses, medical and psychological impacts. A pause. Pete Delaney's wife's documented PTSD from the fire is going to be part of that assessment. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Raymond Cutler, he asked. No cooperation from Cutler, Brooks said. His attorney is fighting everything, which, given what Holston is handing over, is going to make Cutler's situation significantly worse than if he'd come in early. Another pause with a dry edge to it that Caleb hadn't heard from Brooks before. Sometimes the people who think they're the most protected end up the most exposed. What about the TRO against Marcus and his people? Holston's new attorney withdrew it this morning as part of the cooperation framework, Brooks said. It's gone. Caleb exhaled slowly. There's going to be a federal press release, Brooks said, probably this afternoon or tomorrow morning, announcing the investigation, the cooperation agreement, the scope of the case. Once that's public, the story Holston told at the press conference becomes obviously what it was, a last-ditch attempt to control the narrative before everything collapsed. He paused. Your name is going to be in it, Caleb, as the complainant who initiated the evidence chain. I wanted you to know that before it goes out. That's fine, Caleb said. You sure it's going to bring attention? It already brought attention, Caleb said. A different kind. This is better. He hung up and sat at his kitchen table and looked out the window at the field and the scar where the barn used to be and the apple trees along the east fence that were full and green in the September light. He sat there for a long time without moving, just breathing, just being in the house that Rachel had loved and that was still standing. Gerald knocked at the door an hour later. He came in without being invited because that was the kind of neighbor he was, poured himself coffee, and sat down across from Caleb. Brooks called me too, Gerald said. I figured he would. Leanne's going to testify, Gerald said. She already agreed, said she'd been ready since the night she pulled those records. He wrapped his hands around his cup. She's something, my daughter. She is, Caleb agreed. Gerald looked at the window, at the field, at the place where the barn used to be. You're going to rebuild it, he said. It wasn't a question. Yes, Caleb said. I want to help. Caleb looked at him. I know how to frame a barn, Gerald said. Built mine in 1987. Did most of it myself with 3 neighbors in a case of beer over a long weekend. He met Caleb's eyes steadily. I'd like to do the same for yours, if you'll let me. Gerald, it's not charity, Gerald said. Don't make it charity. It's neighbors. He paused. It's what people do. Caleb looked at him for a moment. All right, he said. Thank you. Gerald nodded once and drank his coffee and didn't make anything else of it, which was exactly right. The federal press release went out at 3:17 that afternoon. By evening, the regional news had the story, and it was nothing like the narrative Holston had tried to construct at the community hall. The headline in the Missoula outlet, the reporter who had asked the right questions at the right moment, ran at the top of their site for 2 days. Federal investigation exposes land fraud scheme targeting rural Montana farmers, county commissioner at center. Beneath it was a photograph, not of bikers on a property line, but of Caleb Dawson standing in front of the burned footprint of his barn, taken by the same reporter who had asked his permission and gotten it. He looked in the photograph like what he was, a 68-year-old farmer in work clothes standing on his own land, nothing more and nothing less. But the story beneath the photograph was everything. Pete Delaney's story was in it, attributed with his full permission. Gerald's notebook was referenced. Leanne's records work was described. And at the bottom of the article, a line that Caleb read twice. The investigation was initiated following an arson at the Silver Creek farm of Caleb Dawson, 68, who contacted federal authorities after identifying a pattern of similar incidents across 7 properties in the corridor. He set his phone down on the kitchen table. I thought about the night the barn burned, the way he had stood in the heat and watched 30 years of accumulated life turn to ash and smoke and ember. The way the men in the tree line had laughed easy and comfortable because they believed they were safe, because they had done this before and walked away clean every time. He thought about the metal box in the closet and the combination that was the date he and Rachel had first seen this place and decided it was home. He thought about Marcus's voice on the phone. 3 seconds of silence. Then we're coming. Marcus knocked that evening. He came alone without the others, and Caleb opened the door and they stood for a moment on the porch in the cooling September air. The way two men stand when there is a great deal to say, and neither of them is the kind of person who says a great deal. It's in the press, Marcus said. Yes. Cutler's being arraigned Thursday, Marcus said. I heard from Tommy, who heard from the contact in Billings. He paused. Holston's cooperation is apparently comprehensive. They're saying it's enough to put Cutler away for a significant stretch. Good, Caleb said. They stood a moment more. My people are going to start heading out tomorrow morning, Marcus said. They've got lives, yupes, families. They stayed longer than most would. He looked at Caleb. Not one of them complained. I want you to know that. Not one of them, not once. Caleb looked out at the field where those men had stood watch in the dark for 3 nights, where they had held a property line against 3 trucks and turned them around by simply being present. He thought of Tommy driving to Billings at 3 in the morning. He thought of Chen and his written log of license plates. Tell them, he stopped, started again. Tell them I don't have the right words. I'll tell them exactly that, Marcus said. They'll understand. A pause, comfortable, the kind that only exists between people who have known each other across a very long time and a very significant distance. You could come back, you know, Marcus said quietly. Not to ride, not to be what you were. Just the community, the people. They'd want to know you again. Caleb thought about it honestly. It was a real offer and it deserved a real answer. I don't think so, he said. This is my place. This is what Rachel and I built and what I'm going to keep building. He paused. But I'm glad you came. I'm glad you exist. And I'm glad that 32 years ago I was in that parking lot. So am I, Marcus said, every day since I have been. They shook hands on the porch. It lasted a moment longer than a standard handshake, the way it does between people for whom the gesture carries more history than it usually has to carry. Then Marcus walked back to where his bike was parked, and Caleb stood on the porch and watched him go. The barn came down as an idea and started coming back up as a reality on a Saturday 3 weeks later. Gerald had made some calls, which had led to other calls, which had led to the particular organic process that happens in small communities when something has been taken from someone unjustly and the community decides it has an opinion about that. 14 people showed up on a Saturday morning with tools and lumber and the organized, purposeful energy of people who have agreed on something without needing much discussion. Not all of them knew Caleb well. Some of them knew Gerald. Some of them had read the article in the Missoula paper. Some of them were simply people who had heard what happened and decided that coming was the right thing to do, the way people in rural communities make that decision quietly and without ceremony. Pete Delaney came. He worked alongside Gerald for 6 hours and didn't say much, but the quality of his silence was different from what it had been in his small rented kitchen 3 weeks earlier. It was the silence of a man who is building something, not avoiding something. His wife came too, and she brought food, and she talked to the other wives and neighbors who had gathered, and at one point Caleb saw her laughing at something someone said, a real laugh. Unguarded, and he had to look away for a moment because it meant something he didn't quite have the words for. Leanne Pouet worked at the records table they had set up to track the lumber orders because that was who she was, and no one suggested she do anything else. Brooks came by in the afternoon out of uniform in jeans and a work shirt and picked up a hammer without asking whether he should and worked until the light started going. At one point, Caleb was standing back, watching the frame of the new barn, going up the skeleton of it clean and straight, rising where the old one had stood, and Gerald came and stood beside him, the way he'd stood beside him the night of the fire without saying anything for a while. It's going to be bigger than the old one, Gerald said finally. Good bones, Caleb said. Rachel would have liked it. Caleb looked at the frame, at the new wood in the September light, at the 14 people moving around it with purpose, and without being directed, knowing what needed doing and doing it. She'd have fed everyone twice, Caleb said, and probably it improved the design. Gerald made a sound that was almost a laugh. Probably. They stood together and watched it rise. Raymond Cutler was indicted on 7 counts of public corruption, conspiracy to commit arson, and wire fraud 3 weeks after that. His trial was set for the following spring. The federal prosecutor's office released a statement describing the case as one of the most comprehensive rural land fraud schemes documented in Montana in 2 decades. Victor Holston's cooperation agreement resulted in reduced charges, 2 counts of conspiracy, no prison time, a substantial fine and mandatory restitution to all 7 affected families. Pete Delaney received a settlement that represented the full assessed value of his original property plus damages. The other 6 families received comparable arrangements. 2 of them, Caleb heard later, used the money to buy back into farming, different land, different county, but farming, which was the thing they had always done and the thing that had been taken from them. The Missoula Reporter won a regional journalism award for the investigation she'd helped surface. She called Caleb for a follow-up piece, and he declined to be quoted, but told her she'd asked the right question at the right moment, and that mattered. She wrote that it did. Marcus called on the last day of October, which was the day the new barn was finished, not fully outfitted, not quite complete on the inside, but standing sealed against the coming Montana winter solid in a way the old one had been solid. "I heard it's done," Marcus said. "Word travels," Caleb said. "To me it does. I asked Tommy to check in with Gerald every couple weeks." A pause. "I hope that's all right." "That's more than all right," Caleb said. "How does it look?" Caleb stood in the doorway of the new barn and looked at the interior, at the clean walls, the new pegboard along the south wall, where he had already begun carefully and deliberately to rehang tools. Not Rachel's tools, those were gone, but tools he had bought one at a time over the past month, chosen with attention, placed with the specific intentionality of a man who understands that honoring something lost doesn't mean recreating it exactly. It means carrying it forward in the way you live. "It looks like something worth protecting," Caleb said. "That's the best answer," Marcus said. "Marcus," Caleb said, "what you did, what all of you did, I've thought a lot about how to say this properly, and I don't think there is a proper way. So I'll just say it plain. You came when I called. You drove 12 hours on the word of an old man you hadn't spoken to in 32 years. You put your people in positions that had legal and physical risk, and you stayed until it was through." He paused. "I don't know how to match that." "You already matched it," Marcus said. "Are you also?" 32 years ago, in a parking lot, his voice was steady and simple and carried no performance whatsoever. "You don't owe me anything, Caleb. You never did. Debts like that one don't work on a balance sheet. They work on the fact that when someone does something real for you, something that costs them and doesn't benefit them, and they do it anyway, you spend the rest of your life trying to be the kind of person who deserves it." A pause. "That's what you did for me. I tried to do it back. That's all." Caleb stood in the doorway of his new barn, and the October light was coming across the fields at the angle it gets in Montana when the season is turning, and the apple trees along the east fence were losing their leaves, but their branches were still there, still strong, still exactly where Rachel had planted them 26 years ago. He thought about everything that had been taken and everything that it held. I thought about the metal box in the bedroom closet, which was back in its place behind the stacked boxes with the same combination lock and the same photograph inside it, in which he thought of now, not as something hidden, but as something stored, a record of who he had been, preserved in the same way you preserve the things that made you into what you are. He thought about Pete Delaney's wife laughing in the yard on the day the barn frame went up. I thought about Gerald Pwitt standing in a community hall with his hands at his sides and his chin level and his voice steady, saying his name, saying he had a notebook, saying what it held. He thought about Leanne at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, pulling records with her jaw set and her hands steady and not asking for company, but accepting it when it was offered. I thought about Brooks picking up a hammer in jeans and a work shirt and working without being asked until the light was gone. He thought about 14 people on a Saturday morning who came with tools because someone had told them a man's barn had been burned down, and that seemed like something you showed up for. He thought about Marcus Walker at 50 Gray at the Temples, walking up his porch steps after 32 years and saying, "You look old." And Caleb Dawson looked out at the land that Rachel had loved and that he had protected, and that was still standing every inch of it. Apple trees and fences and fields and the new barn rising where the old one had burned, and he understood something that he hadn't had words for before but had now. Victor Holston had looked at this farm and seen an asset, a number, a square footage of land in a quarter he wanted held by an old man alone. He had not seen what the land actually was. It was not 40 acres of Montana soil. It was not a property with assessed value and legal description. It was the place where Rachel had planted 26 years of her life into the ground, and where Caleb had kept every promise he had made to her, and where Gerald drove over in the middle of the night when the sky turned orange, and where Pete Delaney came with a hammer on a Saturday because that was the right thing to do, and where 14 people who owed Caleb Dawson nothing showed up anyway, because that was what people did when they understood what actually mattered. That was not a number. That could not be bought for below market value or burned out of existence or buried in a civil filing at midnight. That was something Victor Holston had never possessed and could not have taken because he had never understood what it was. And Caleb Dawson, standing in the doorway of his new barn with a phone in his hand and the October light across his fields, and 30 years of a life worth living behind him and whatever came next still ahead, Caleb Dawson knew with absolute certainty what Iron Wolf had always known and what the farmer had spent 30 years learning and what the two of them together had finally proven in the hardest possible way. You do not measure a man by the enemies he makes, or the battles he wins, or the name they gave him in a different life on different roads. You measure him by who comes when he calls. And when Caleb Dawson called, they came. Every one of them. That was the whole story. That was all of it. And it was enough.